Ndlovu, founder and editor of the Melanin Notice. The word melanin in the title has nothing to do with the size of my forehead. Now, in my last video, I sort of went out of my way to sort of explain why I believed Africans should maybe rethink our allegiance to our liberation parties for those few countries that still, outwardly support them. And in this analysis, I sort of went deep into the flaws of these parties and why I sort of felt as if they're not really giving back enough. It was very centered towards them, even though I was talking about our own as Africans voting patterns. But for this video, I wanted to talk about us. I wanted to shed light into why democracy doesn't seem to work as well in our continent. Why the African voter may be at times biased. I don't want to say ignorant or arrogant or prejudicial or tribalist or racist or Islamophobic, Christianphobic or whatever. Although all of those factors do contribute to what I'm going to be talking about in this video. You see, growing up, I had very many conversations about democracy, and I had very many detractors because I am a person who sort of loves it. But a lot of very smart people who I've spoken to in my life have pointed out, even when I was at school, that the problem with democracy is that it's a foreign entity. That democracy essentially doesn't belong in our shores. That it's a foreign import. It was created by the Greeks, sort of snatched by the Romans. The Romans then, colonized Londinium, and Londinium becomes London, and then from London, democracy finds its way to Africa and France as well, of course, another former Roman territory. And essentially, there were political structures that existed in Africa prior to. So I'm not going to make an argument as to why I maybe think democracy is the most superior form of political philosophy and practice. I'm just making a video on why I think democracy in this continent, for us, when we go to the polls, we sort of mess everything up. Because there's good and bad in everything. But specifically when it comes to democracy, we Africans tend to throw away all the potential good things about it and instead fall into pre-established prejudicial pathways that will always compromise the progress of our continent. So what am I essentially trying to say? I'm saying I feel like Africa still treats democracy like the chief system, like the chiefdom, or when we had kingdoms, whether it was the Zulu nation, the Ndebele nation, back in the Mansa Musa days, and the legendary empires of the Ashanti and Benin. All of these former systems which relied on loyalty and sort of togetherness in a tribal sense, the tribalistic form, where if you were a small person from a tiny village called Krakraland, right, you were going to vote for someone, you were going to have a chief from Krakraland to represent you. And then all of a sudden what happens is Europeans come through with the Berlin Conference and divide our country up, and our countries up, our continent up actually. And now all of a sudden you have the Krakra people living with the Krakro people and the Gribe people. And you have all these different tribes now brought in together in one country. For example, you have the Zulus and the Xhosas and the Bedi and Sutus in South Africa, which were all different nations, but now they just become South Africa. You have the Kikuyu, the Luos, the Kambas, the Kalenjins, the Maasai, and those were all different people, and they just brought up, and it's called Kenya. And then you have the Kalana, the Shona, the Ndebele, and they're all brought up into one country, and it's called Zimbabwe. Now, this manifests in tribalism. Because Africans, I believe, and this really is an anthropologic sort of theory of mine, used to always have their own representing them. Which is why I feel that the main problem with democracy in Africa is our tribalism. What I'm saying is the same thing is happening now. Where, for example, being a Zimbabwean myself, let's say there's a Ndebele person on the ballot, and my Shona friend sees a Shona person on the ballot. Maybe our history, our archetype, our our DNA is always going to lead us to do what our ancestors did and send one of our own forward to be our own representative. And yes, I know to a certain extent we still have chiefs and all of that, but you know, the face of the nation is always going to be the person who is the president, and that manifests itself in an election, and that manifests itself through voting. So intrinsically, because now I can't be a person in a village who has his Ndlovu leader representing my entire nation or the entirety of my tribe, I'm maybe going to try and get my guy over there and place him in the driver's seat. And my Shona friend is going to try to do the same thing. And that tension is always going to be a problem. I'm trying to speak hypothetically, of course, but of course I don't really have to, because I was living in Nairobi, Kenya back in 2007 during the post-election violence. And that election was sort of marred and scarred by sort of, well, tribalistic elements, where you had a great African figure, Mwai Kibaki, and he was a Kikuyu man, and the Kikuyus voted for him in great numbers. And then you had a Luo man named Raila Amolo Odinga Obambo Owadgakinyi, who was voted for by majority of all the Luos, and then this sort of boiled up in the end result, because people felt like maybe one party shouldn't have won, and the other people said the other party shouldn't have won, and some people were saying both sides sort of may have tried to manipulate the situation of the election. Others said that their sides rightfully won, and all of this stuff. And because these people were from two different tribes, it became sort of there was a tribal element to everything. The tribal tension sort of escalated, and all of a sudden Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN at the time, great Ghanaian man, African legend, had to fly into Kenya and sort of, you know, make things balanced and make things okay. But the reason why this is happening isn't just because of tribalistic elements. There are also religious elements. Like, for example, in Nigeria, where the Muslim population is 50% to 52%, and the Christian population is 46% to 48%, at least this being the case also in 2014, I believe. And this division manifested in Buhari versus Goodluck Jonathan. And Buhari won by 53%, and good old Goodluck Jonathan got only 43% of the vote. So you can tell that the swing there was sort of like the 2% of the people who aren't necessarily Islamic or Christian, and therefore made maybe their decision just based off of, you know, different reasons than religion. It seems that just as with tribalism in Kenya, in that 2014 election in Nigeria, people just tended to vote with a candidate that had their religion. But it's not just that with Africa. Oh, no, you got it wrong entirely. It's not just that either. Because in South Africa, the problem is now race. Race becomes an issue. Seeing as the ANC has most of the black vote, and the DA has most of the white vote. With 93% of white South Africans stating that in between 2016 and 2021, they had all at least once voted for the DA, according to conversations.com. I'm saying that we are biased. As a continent, what drives our voting is not what should drive democracy, because what should drive democracy? Policy, ideas, political theories that may indeed bring about a better future for your country in question and for your community. What Africans need to do is throw away tribal identity, religious identity, and racial identity, and instead adopt an ideological identity. Every African should essentially ask themselves, am I a conservative? Do I like a limited government, a rather large military, traditional old school family values that will keep everything in order, like a Jacob Rees-Mogg? Or am I a fascist? Do I think that authoritarian rule is the way to go? Should we say goodbye to democracy, just have one party and hire the police state to sort of just keep everything in line, like good old Benito Mussolini? Or perhaps you're tired of the bourgeoisie and want the proletariat to take over. Perhaps you're tired of all this private ownership of land, and you thought Karl Marx had some good ideas. You're a good communist human being who wants to share all the resources, and that's your political ideology and your identity. Or you're a populist, And you believe it is the common interests of the man that matter. And the masses have been subjugated by globalization and foreign interests. And much like Bolsonaro of Brazil, and to some extent Donald Trump, you're going to fight for the average working man, and those are the people you identify with. Or you think communism goes a bit too far and capitalism goes a bit too far, and you found a safe space in the middle and you call yourself a social democrat. You like social democracy. You found a sweet, sweet spot where you don't want the government to regulate everything, but you still like a free open market. So you believe, hey, I believe that hospitals should be cheaper or even free for everyone to have healthcare. But I also think that companies should be allowed to innovate and create products for the public. You would be like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, or Senator Bernie Sanders. You'll fight for cheaper housing, you'll fight for cheaper education and cheaper transport, just allowing the world to be fair yet economically practical. You see, all of these different ideas are ways that you can sort of navigate your thinking politically. And it's sort of like a bottom-up way of doing things, because if we start as Africans asking ourselves these questions about ourselves, about yourself specifically, what do I believe in? What financial policies do I believe in? Environmental policies do I believe in? Social policies do I believe in? Then the politicians are going to have to respond to those questions. This because currently they do not do that at all. Now, seriously ask yourself. Think about your average African politician. Think about walking up to them on the street and randomly asking them a question about their party's manifesto's policy towards natural gas tax. Or even something more important like disability rights for the elderly. Or just disability rights in general. Are they gonna know? And why are you voting for them if you don't know? Aren't you gonna be old one day? Aren't you going to be a person who needs help in the future, in the far off distant future? Wouldn't you want to support a guy who gives or passes a bill in Parliament or advocates for a bill from the State House that says that you are going to be taken care of in the future based off of the tax dollars that you're paying now? But Africans don't want to ask themselves these questions. Africans prefer to be like, oh no, I actually don't know what that guy believes in, but the reason why I have to vote for him is because I'm pretty sure that 200 years ago, my ancestors and his ancestors were from the same village and they even slaughtered a goat together. And if you need proof, there's a painting on a cave wall. And we can talk as Africans about how we believe this guy's corrupt or that guy's corrupt, but what about us? We're corrupt. We're mentally corrupt. We're corrupted by this disease of tribalism, of racism, of Islamophobia, Christian phobia, all of these different weird things that we use to divide us, to deny us from the benefits of the political system that we currently have. You may like democracy, you may not like democracy, but it's what we got. So let's use it properly to the best of our abilities. See, it's like I said earlier, it's going to be bottom up. So, if we start asking of ourselves these questions, we form our own personal political identities, and then after that, we start asking the politicians, they as well will have to sort of coalesce and form these political, ideological movements. And what do I mean by this specifically? I mean, in England, there's a party called the Conservative Party, who represent conservatives. And then there's the Labour Party, who are meant to sort of represent the average working man. Remember I talked about populism, or I talked about social democracy earlier, talked about liberalism, and all of those different aspects are represented in this party. Or in the United States of America, you have the Republicans and you have the Democrats. The Republicans on the right wing, being the ones who are more conservatives, and the Democrats being more liberal. So, for example, with Republicans in America, if someone tells you they're Republican and that, they're in the States, then you know, for example, what they think. It's not like here in Africa, you'd ask someone their tribe and you'd know who they're voting for. In America, you'd ask them, oh, you're a Republican, therefore, this is what you think. Oh, you're a Democrat, so this is what you think. If you're a Democrat, so essentially what you're telling me about yourself, good man, is that you want gun control. for these 50 great United States, you would also probably most likely not care about the traditional form of marriage, and you think if a man can marry a man or a woman can marry a woman, it's cool. And also, you believe that women deserve reproductive rights, that it's a sad thing that Roe v. Wade was overturned and now women are limited to get their abortions. Good man, I can also surmise, conclude, I can also arrive at the notion that you, good democratic sir, are a person who really wants a smaller military because we spent too much money sending it away to conquer foreign lands in a neo-colonialistic form of function. You, being a Democrat over there, I also know that you think healthcare is too high, that you wish that it was easier for Americans to help themselves when they fall ill and have an ailment, that you're pissed that a grandmother who hurts her hip in her house is going to be charged $14,000 just for the ambulance that took her to the hospital. You, my good friend, my good Democrat, you perhaps, perchance, per dream, wish that university education was cheaper. You can come to all these conclusions about how someone sees the world by them telling you who they identify as. And obviously, you don't have to agree with all of those things. That's why you have democratic primaries, where you have the far left, like the AOCs and the Bernie Sanderses, and then you'll have like the more middle ground, I guess, Joe Biden's and Pete Buttigieg's of the world. You know, all of those things that I said, I'm obviously being hyperbolic and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we know that their ideology falls within that spectrum. And then you walk up to someone and they say, hey, I'm a Republican. And okay, so they want a large army because they believe America needs to be protected. They want smaller government and they want state control for everything. These Republican people, I tell you, they want lower taxes because the government doesn't do anything right ever. They believe in traditional family values because it's Adam and Eve, it's not Adam and Steve. And life obviously begins at conception. Why are you saying it begins at first breath? Abortion should be legal. Down with Roe v. Wade. We know this. We know that all the Republican man wants is after a long day of hard work to come home, light a cigar, drink some whiskey, stare into the wilderness and the stars, and think about his old love, Annabelle, who he left in the old country, because, as he puts it, I just didn't know no better. We know all these things because in other democratic territories, people do not identify their democratic allegiance with factors that they can't control. You can't control the fact that you were born black. They can't control the fact that you were born Ndebele or a Sutu or a Maasai or Igbo. You can't control the fact that, well, you can control your religion, but oftentimes you're born into your religion and you stay with that religion. So when you're voting for people who just have that identity with you, what are you doing? That's why people say, racists say, that Africans don't have ideas. That the West will always be ahead of us in terms of innovation, because at least even when they're choosing who is their leader, they choose off of a point of intellect, as opposed to a point of, oh, guess what, I was born into this tribe, let's go. You see, and I've always said this, African elections are like popularity contests. It's like the way they used to elect the class president or the prom queen in high school. It's like, oh my goodness, dude, like his dad drives a Mercedes. Let's vote for him. Oh, dude, that guy, like he's really cool. He took off on the helicopter. He's awesome. So, if you fall sick tomorrow, how are his policies going to save your life? If you care about the environment, is this politician going to, construct buildings and natural reserves? Does he even have an environmental or green policy? Does he have a plan for the nation's debt? Does the nation have any debt? What's the best way to nurse the debt? Should the nation take on more debt? And how much debt should the nation take on? And how would they pay it back? Who are his allies? His ideology. Is he a communist who's going to side with Russia? Is he more a capitalist who's going to side with the Western world? If there is a war that is happening with Russia, is he going to make us join that war? Will it be my kids in that war? Will it be my kids in a war with an American enemy? These are all questions that we need to ask ourselves before we go to a polling station. But we don't, because you know what? tribe and religion and race matter more. But I tell you, Africa, there is a glimmer of hope. And where is this place? Oh yes. What some would call the land of my distant, distant ancestors before we ran away from Shaka Zulu because of all those cows. South Africa. Now South Africa is an interesting case because, just as I said, in Nigeria the problem was religion. People were voting on religious lines, at least in that 2014 election. And in Kenya, circa 2007, it was mainly tribe. But in South Africa, the issue is race. Why? Because obviously it has a very complex racial history. Apartheid ending in 1994. The NC wins the election, and then after that you have the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party becomes the Democratic Alliance, and the Democratic Alliance now, as I said earlier, forms the majority of the white vote. But you see, because the ANC gave independence to South Africa, they sort of worked unchallenged. They could sort of just do whatever they wanted. It would have seemed virtually impossible for anything to ever sort of usurp the ANC's power. They gave black people democratic rights, therefore black people vote for them when they're exercising their democracy. Enter one of the most famous people in the world now because of that whole Cyril Ramaphosa, Donald Trump intervention, Julius Malema. You see, South Africa, though once a country where I'd say it was just about race, has now evolved and become a country where I would say political ideology really, really started to matter. Gone are the days where the ANC could just do whatever they want, because effectively that's what was happening. Julius Malema was an ANC youth leader, right? He was managing the youth league, but he was sort of a left-wing radical.
This is a building of a revolutionary party, and you know nothing about the revolution. So here you behave or else you jump. Here you don't laugh. Chief, can you get security to remove this thing?
So he gets suspended in 2012 for effectively sowing division. And this division is the fact that he's sort of a left-wing radical. In the spectrum of left-wing or right-wing, Julius Malema was definitely far on the left. As I'm sure you could tell by that rather, I don't like it, disgusting Kill the Boer song. He wanted complete reformation. He was like, you ANC people aren't really doing anything. He was like, years have passed, 72% of the land is still owned, the arable farmland is still owned by the white population. They control most of the economy, some say up to 80% of the economy. And we're just still suffering like prior to apartheid. Black people have no self-determination. Black people can't do anything. You know what? Maybe I should leave. And after his suspension, he formed the Economic Freedom Fighters. What did this mean? It meant that the ANC's black monopoly was compromised. Now, black people were like, it's not just we're gonna deal with Nelson Mandela, then deal with Thabo Mbeki, and then deal with Jacob Zuma, and then deal with Cyril Ramaphosa, no matter what their policies are. There's now another black alternative called the Economic Freedom Fighters, which he helmed, Julius Malema, which practiced far left political thinking. And now, the young black South African, or the old South African, thinking, oh my goodness, nothing has changed, or the young guy thinking, oh my goodness, will it ever change, like in the future, will I have a different future? They have an alternative option. And that's just the start of it. Floyd Shivambu, Buyeseni Ndlozi, all of these intellectual titans, and that's what I'm actually going to call them, also joined the ranks, with Dr. Ndlozi even being crowned the People's Bay.
No. Ginger is going to be very hurt about me being available.
Honorable Ndlozi, please take your seat.
Everyone knows I'm with Ginger.
Honorable Ndlozi, the floor of the House is not where personal interest is expressed.
In their year of formation, they became the third largest party in the general elections of 2013, getting themselves 6.35% of the votes in 25 parliamentary seats out of the available 400. They had effectively announced their arrival. This then led to an 8.2% share of the 2016 municipal local government elections and a 10.8% share of the 2019 general elections 3 years later, with 19 more seats, bringing the total to 44 out of 400. But gentlemen, and gentle ladies, I've only been talking about the white and the black. But there are very many more shades to the rainbow nation that is South Africa. Enter the legendary Gayton Mackenzie. A titan of a man if I've ever seen one, who in 2013, the year of our Lord, the same year that Julius Malema made the EFF, teamed up with his friend Kenny Kunene to create the Patriotic Alliance. Now, the reason why from an identity perspective, which I know is sort of counterintuitive and hypocritical to my argument, why I mentioned the whole Rainbow Nations thing, is because it is a good thing, I believe, that colored people have representation. Because Gayton Mackenzie talks about, personally, how there was no sort of, there was no one to sort of look after his community, he felt, when he was growing up. There was no specific party to sort of look after colored individuals in South Africa. And as he puts it in his interviews, they do not know how we colored boys suffered.
But I'm saying to you that the colored people are disappointed people. Penel, we are number one when it comes to alcohol fetal syndrome. We are number one when it comes to children school-going age that's not in school. We are number one when it comes to children in school that don't finish matric. We are number one when it comes to per capita people that go into prison. We are number one when it comes to people finishing matric and don't get university entrance. There's a problem there.
However, because we remember what this video is about, this is about ideology, not just representation. He comes into the picture as a very successful businessman with another very successful businessman, Kenny Kunene, and they're a right-wing party. They're a non-white right-wing party. Interesting. So he looks at the scope of things and all the illegal immigrants in the country, and he says the illegal immigrants have to be deported. He looks at the housing and he says the housing is substandard and needs to be improved. He comes up with financing plans for land reform instead of just like saying that the land needs to change. So now someone like Julius Malema has competition because Malema is saying that with the EFF, everyone needs to understand that life will get better because we'll take a more left-wing, hard approach where we redistribute the wealth by nationalizing everything, and that's the way everything is going to be done, and we'll just take land away from white people and we'll give it away. And then now there's an intellectual sort of battle because Gayton comes and says, well, maybe the reason why people are suffering is because very many illegal immigrants are taking their jobs. I'm going to deport the illegal immigrants, and that's going to give them their jobs. And I think we should go to the banks and come up with financial plans to sort of come up with methods that we can actually have a reasonable form of land distribution and land reform. He also stresses traditional old school values. I don't know what his LGBT stance is, but South Africa is currently, I think, the only African country that allows gay marriage. And there's probably sections of the very Christian and maybe in some areas very Muslim sections of South Africa where they probably don't really like that. So now they have another political alternative who could actually maybe change that if that's what they wanted. But it's good when these ideas sort of lead to like all of these different political parties because now you have all of these different options to vote for. Perhaps once upon a time the colour community felt that they had to vote for the non-white party, which was the ANC, but now all of a sudden they have a person who they may agree with and may represent them in their cultural specific peculiarities. But that's not it. That's not the end of this rather strange political evolution of South Africa. Because after his ousting, Jacob Zuma formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the spear of the nation. This in 2023, just a year before the elections, similar to how Julius Malema formed MK before the previous elections, or two elections prior. And see, here's the thing about Jacob Zuma. He was seen at the end of his time as being maybe surplus to requirements, or not the best, inefficient maybe unserious, not a political heavyweight, maybe intellectually.
We announced that our membership figures stood at 700, listen properly, 769,820
But here's the thing, and this goes to my analysis of the ANC. The ANC sort of became this random, serviceable, average, misguided, basic. It was like there were so many ideas in that party that, like, I don't think anyone could really do anything. You're being pulled to the right, you're being pulled to the left, and therefore you just end up in the center, not really maybe being who you are. And also, it's just like with supply and demand, you know. When there is more competition, when you know that now coloureds can vote for Gayton Mackenzie, when you know that left-wing blacks can now vote for the EFF, then you need to step up your game. So this Zuma that we saw in 2023 was no regular Zuma. The MK Party manifesto made many people wonder, could Zuma have been doing stuff like this all the time? Let's talk about it. They were advocating for free education from kindergarten to post-grad. That's very important because the fees must fall, let's not call it a fiasco, but noble cause, where a lot of young South Africans just felt like we can't even learn if we want to, because this country is too expensive for us to gain knowledge. They also wanted a national healthcare service, very important for a country like South Africa. I mean, you saw what happened with USAID when Donald Trump and the Trump administration removed the financial services that were funding medical care, certain aspects of medical care in South Africa.
There could be 6 million new HIV infections and 4 million more AIDS-related deaths globally by the year 2029 due to the sweeping aid cuts by the US. That's according to the UN, which is releasing a report on global HIV infections today, its first since the cuts took effect. It's being announced in South Africa, the country with the highest number of people living with HIV and home to the world's leading HIV researchers, whose work could be set back years as a result of the US actions.
I can't remember what the drug was called, but essentially there's this medication that pregnant women take who are HIV positive to prevent the disease from transmitting into their child in the womb. And by removing the funding for that drug, there were children who actually did end up getting the virus themselves. And what Zuma is doing here, saying that there needs to be a national healthcare service, is sort of going to do things like not let South Africa be caught out. Because essentially South Africa, with their economy and their size, shouldn't be needing to rely on foreign aid to provide basic healthcare to their citizens. And what that actually is a failed administration, which Jacob Zuma was a part of, but now is coming up with ideas to change. Another thing that Zuma was a custodian over, maybe he wasn't the cause, but he was definitely president when it was happening, as it's still happening, is the high rate of crime in South Africa. And for that, in his new manifesto for the MK Party, he's questioning whether or not the death penalty should be introduced, which would obviously be an incentive to prevent people from committing vicious crimes, even though personally I myself don't agree with the death penalty, Christian as I am. But then also he's brought up the question of, revoking the right of gay marriage, because now he wants to seem more traditional and more conservative, and just like Gayton Mackenzie and the Patriotic Alliance, sort of appeal to the more conservative and traditional South African voter. But remember what I talked about earlier. It starts at the bottom and rises to the top. If we become ideologically inclined instead of identity inclined, then what's going to happen is the people at the top, the political parties, are going to have to respond to us. Fees must fall, for example, was a key incentive in people like Julius Malema saying, the socio-economic structure of this country, of that country, South Africa, needs to change. And then eventually it leads to all of these different developments which spur the change. The only reason why Julius Malema isn't the Julius Malema of old when he was in the ANC is because now he has to say, oh my goodness, the Patriotic Alliance exists, and they're out here saying maybe gay marriage should go away for the conservative-minded people. Oh my goodness, Julius Malema exists, and he's saying land should be taken away without compensation, which is another idea that MK are also espousing in their manifesto. It's almost as if there's a fight for political thinking within the country, which is sort of an awesome thing, regardless of what side you fall into. South Africa, to me at least, sort of seems like the pearl of political ideology on our beautiful continent. So quick history, you have the ANC, which is like the only popular black option for everyone. And in that party you have all these different ideas. You have the far left ANC, you have the right wing ANC, the center ANC. And then after that you have one guy be so far left that he has to leave, Julius Malema, he forms his own party. You have a president who's ousted, Jacob Zuma, he forms his own party. And now the black vote is just thrown into free fall. And the only thing that you can do to sort of like, you know, bring someone here or bring someone there is share with them your ideas, as opposed to the fact that, yo, I'm black, because now there are a bunch of popular black guys all fighting for people's minds and not assuming a right to their support based off of their identity. But then there are also black right-wing parties like Nkatha Freedom Party. There are white right-wing parties like Freedom Front Plus. And then there's Mzansi Rise, which is like a moderate party. And with all of these different parties and identities, we set the scene for the 2023 general election of South Africa. And my goodness, was it interesting. So the ANC, the African National Congress, lost 17.32 percentage points. The Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, Julius Malema, lost 1.2 percentage points. The Democratic Alliance, the DA, they gained 1.04 percentage points. Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, good old Jacob Zuma's party, they gained 14.58 percentage points. Ridiculous. The Patriotic Alliance, Gayton Mackenzie's shop, they gained 2.02 percentage points. Nkatha Freedom Party gained 0.47 percentage points, with the biggest winner of course being MK with their 14.58 and the biggest loser being ANC with their 17.32 percentage point drop.
All right, now this is a much clearer picture. Now, as the pieces of the puzzle are now getting together, we now have an idea of where the parties are headed in terms of seat allocation in Parliament, with the ANC having garnered 159 seats. That's about a 40.2%. They've lost 79 seats in Parliament, and they'll need to work really, really hard in terms of convincing some of the parties to get into a coalition with. Now, the Democratic Alliance has gained 3 seats, and these are predicted seats, by the way, because the data is still coming in, still being captured. They will have about 87 seats if the results are anything to go by, with a 21.7% of the national votes overall. The MK party, and they're coming in with, well, still a new party. They've gained 58 seats, predicted seats, that is, with a reflection of 14.8%. That's 2,249,799 votes. The EFF, which has been in the past election the 3rd biggest party, has now slipped to being the 4th biggest party with 1,427,013 votes. That's a 9.4% reflection of the national score overall, with 39 seats, but they've lost 5 seats in Parliament.
But now the ANC, as you know, in the current day is still in power. Because why? Because they had to form a coalition in order to maintain their influence. And who do they form this coalition with? Surprisingly, right-wing parties. And also, their, what I used to think was their mortal enemy, the DA, the Democratic Alliance. So just to put it into perspective, South African elections used to be ran on race, right? There was a white party and the black party. But then, people start thinking. People start having ideas. Manifestos start getting written. Ideas now become more of a precious resource than identity was. And all of a sudden, the two former old guards, the ANC and the DA, the guys who used to just fight for power and be number 1 and number 2, have to work together to fight against the people who have convinced African minds. Now just think about this for a second. The ANC, in their desperation, gave the DA access over home affairs, basic education. They gave party leader John Steenhuisen the Ministry of Agriculture, while the Patriotic Alliance's head honcho, Mackenzie, took over the Ministry of Sports, Arts and Culture, while the Nkatha Freedom Party's leader became the Minister of Corporate Government and Traditional Affairs. I found it very interesting, especially because this is sort of a right-wing alliance. And that begs the question, why didn't the ANC side with the left wing? Like literally, you're a former president of that party, or who belonged to that party, and a former youth leader, it would be perfect. It would be 3 former ANC leaders in a coalition. And it would have been a huge majority. But no. Instead, the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa decided to go in the right-wing direction. Puzzling. Like Mandela was charged with being a communist. The former ANC and communist Russia were like best friends. But now, faced with an option to either side with right-wingers or 2 political parties who want to make industries public, which is a staple of communism and Marxism, who want to redistribute wealth, who want to redistribute land for the general public of the people, when faced with those guys, the right-wingers, or with these people who basically form the tenets of the original ideology of ANC, they side over here. That's what happens when you're battling with an ideological battleground. You find out who people really are. And how is the GNU, that government of national unity, how is it going? Well, initially things were great. You know, the inflation dropped below 4%. The power cuts, although they stopped before, the load shedding stopped before, they vanished on the onset of the election. The stock market rose by about 20%. And why were things going so well? Because there was a balance of power. The ANC couldn't run rampant anymore. They couldn't loot like they were doing before. They couldn't be as inefficient and make poor decisions, because every time they would have liked to, there was a DA guy, there could have been a PA guy, there could have been a Inkatha Freedom Party guy looking at them saying, what are you doing? But it is fairly evident, especially in retrospect, that this was a honeymoon period, that the happiness would not necessarily last for long, and quite frankly, it did not. And I also blame like Elon Musk and like Trump, because the DA could now fight back against the land reform ideas that the ANC eventually adopted, which were much like MK and EFF. They adopted their ideas because essentially they had to. But the DA could say, we stand against this, and so does the richest man in the world and the most powerful man in the world, in Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and that was an advantage.
We have thousands of stories talking about it, sure. And we have documentaries, we have news stories, and that. Is Natalie here? Somebody here to turn that? I could show you a couple of things, and it has to be responded to.
Yeah, sure.
Let me see the articles, please, if you would, and turn the lights down, and just put this on. It's right behind you, Johan.
There's nothing this parliament can do, with or without you. People are going to occupy land. We require no permission from you, from the president, from no one. We don't care. We can do whatever you want to do. Who are you to tell us whether we can occupy land or not? We are going to occupy land. Yeah. South African occupy land. That's who we are.
It's actually quite interesting to think about. Even though the DA were a smaller party in the coalition, second biggest, but not the biggest, not the majority, they have effectively like a lot of influence, because Trump and Elon are 2 huge mammoths of men with power and money, and they've made it very clear that the DA's ideas are who they more side with. But all of these divisions culminate on the 19th of February 2025, when there was meant to be a budget announcement for the financial budget of the year, and in the last minute it was called off, because there had to be an emergent cabinet meeting. But what I like about this is what Cyril Ramaphosa said, because he said that this is basically democracy at work. And when you think about it, it actually is. And that's why I'm saying South Africa have achieved proper democracy. You see, the problem was essentially the ANC wanted to increase the VAT tax from 15% to 17% in order to raise 3.1 billion rand. But essentially the DA and other members of the coalition disagreed, because they felt it would be unfair for lower income families to have to pay this extra tax. And funnily enough, the EFF, they criticized the postponement of the reading of the bill, but they sided more with the DA. Like Malema's party. Obviously because they side with the lower income portion of society, and they agree with the DA that it's unfair for them to have to raise this 3.1 billion. So in truth, it's all gotten kind of messy. But it's a beautiful messy. This happened and that happened and that happened and this happened, and all these ideas were thrown across the room, and there was a lot of intellectual clashing between these different ideologies and all these different groups trying to say, how should we do this financially? What's the best way based off of our fiscal policy as it relates to yours, as we're in this government of national unity? And eventually everything stayed the same, and the VAT did not increase. Is it right to call it VAT? Should I say VAT? Because effectively, when all was said and done, VAT remained at just 15%. But just think about this, right? The VAT not increasing meant that lower income South Africans could maintain a decent standard of living, or rather that it wouldn't get worse. But if the coalition didn't exist, the ANC would not have in any way, shape or form made this alteration. They were forced to. And why were they forced to? Because of the GNU, because of the coalition. And why does the coalition exist? The coalition exists because of MK and because of EFF, because of ideas, because of people not just voting for the Black Party, but voting for parties that address their needs, their concerns, and their ideologies and their belief systems. In EFF and the MK Party, pushing the ANC to the right, into the coalition, through their ideas, South Africa is a better place and poor people are more secured, because now the ANC is forced to not have a monopoly and forced to actually reconsider what could be bad ideas, making South African democracy a better place. Why then shouldn't Africa not do the same? From Cape Town to Cairo, let's go for it. We're a smart continent. People think we're not. We can succeed. People think we can't. We can stop shallow, bigoted, prejudicial motivations for the voters' ballot and only select people who we believe in. We can take democracy more seriously and not vote for the person who happens to be Christian or Muslim, or happens to be Zulu or Shona, or happens to be black, or happens to be white. Because you can see from the bottom to the top, things can actually change if we start using our minds. They will have to listen to us. Malema thought for himself, Jacob Zuma thought for himself, Mackenzie thought for himself, and he changed South Africa. And yes, I know it didn't revolutionize everything, but this is just a small example of what can happen if we believe in our minds and not factors that we can't control, like our tribe or our race. There's a difference between us and animals, and it's conscious thinking. In the same way, a hyena always runs with a hyena, or a cheetah always runs with their cheetahs. Then if you're a person who only votes for your tribe, or only votes for your race, and this is a harsh thing to say, what separates you from animal? Seriously, it's a genuine question. We have been given these amazing things in between our ears to allow us to formulate arguments, opinions, ideas, reason, the ability to form analyses, to critique, and we have to use that. Because if we don't, then what's the point of being human? What this is sort of like an all or nothing approach. Oh, finally, we got a Ndebele, or we got a Shona, or whatever tribe in power right now. Our people are going to be safe for a very long time. Okay, and then when you lose, you're just going to suffer until you get in power again? No. The standards of Africa needs to change. We need new benchmarks, new principles, new ways of looking at things. I talked about my problem with different political parties in my last video. This one is for us. This one is my problem with you. You watching this right now. Yes, Mkhwekazi Silizwe Randlovu does not approve. Maybe I am being a bit hard on us, I'm not going to lie. Mkhwekazi Silizwe Randlovu, founder and editor of the Melon Notice. The word melon in the title has nothing to do with the size of my forehead. It's simply my initials.